Hello and welcome along to the second part of the training session on the teacher-pupil learning dialogue, where we are going to be looking in particular at the feedback loop and how we can use questions in the classroom to aid pupil schema building. So we start off with a little bit of recap on what we covered in the first session on how the importance of schema building whenever it comes to developing understanding amongst our pupils. And this model for how the mind works, I think, can be helpful in that context. And it goes like this, that of all the things that we could pay attention to in the environment, we need to select the thing that's appropriate. And that's why it's really important in our class in the first instance to make sure that our pupils are paying attention. If they're not paying attention, we'll fall at the first hurdle. But let's say that they are paying attention and this information starts to come into their working memory, this new information. How do they make sense of it? Well, what they do is to draw down some information from their long-term memory, which is their knowledge schema. This is a richly connected body of knowledge that helps them then to interpret this new information. And we discover that in that process, our prior knowledge is key. We interpret this new information based on the previous prior knowledge that we have. So the exercise I gave you in the first task was to show you the 3 different jerseys and ask you to match them up. Those were 3 football jerseys. Well, they were 3 football jerseys if you had that prior knowledge. If not, you matched them on other things as well. So it is important whenever we are learning, we've got their attention, we need to activate the correct prior knowledge to help them to begin to assimilate this process of making meaning from this information. And the process begins. I've drawn this as a dotted red line because initially it is shaky. The process can be difficult and can be challenging. But it is extremely important that whenever we're planning for our explanations that we're aware of things like the prior knowledge that they need to be aware of, and also things like these threshold concepts, these things that unlock or block understanding. So the example that I often quote in this is the salt of a metal in chemistry. Unless and until I know what that term means, that is going to be a blockage for me understanding what comes next, no matter how clear the explanation is. So our explanations need to be planned very carefully to activate the correct prior knowledge, whether that's subject-based knowledge or an example or an analogy, and to anticipate the threshold concepts, where they might go wrong, where the misconceptions might lie, and how we might address them. So let me give you an example of how I do that in geography. And whenever I was doing this training session with our staff, I asked them this question: how do you get from higher fertility levels to lower fertility levels? What is it that causes the crude birth rate to drop in a country? And this is the list of the answers that they gave me. Now, these answers are great. Each one of them makes a valid point. There's some very good input into that. But at the moment, what I've got here is a series of disconnected points. At the moment, they haven't been integrated well into a schema, and I haven't connected them together to find meaning. In other words, they're kind of like this. Now, at this point, I would love to have been able to play the actual video clip of the Morecambe and Wise 1971 Christmas special featuring Andre Previn, but due to copyright reasons I can't, so I'm going to have to do the worst thing possible, which is try and explain a joke. Bear with me. If you know this, it'll hopefully bring back the memories. If you don't, I would strongly advise you to go and watch this little video clip. It's comedy genius. Andre Previn was a very serious and very acclaimed conductor at the time, and he was appearing on Morecambe and Wise show, a classic Saturday night 1970s entertainment show with those 2 comedians. After various shenanigans and difficulties, Previn stands up to conduct the orchestra in the introduction to a brilliant classical piece, and the orchestra plays very, very well. Morecambe is sitting down at the piano just waiting to begin, waiting to get his cue, and after the introduction, Previn indicates over to him to start playing, and Morecambe gives the big thumbs up as we're anticipating this beautiful piece of piano music that matches the classical music the orchestra are playing. Only that's not what we get. Morecambe sits down and plays something entirely different, just a little strange little ditty that he's probably made up or something like that. Previn at this stage reacts in faux horror. How dare you desecrate this piece of music that I've been conducting? And down he comes to stop Morecambe in his playing. And he says to him, "You're playing all the wrong notes." And here's the genius of the timing of the comedy great that was Eric Morgan. He stood up, grabbed him by his lapels, fixed his glasses, pulled him in close, and he said, "No, I'm playing all the right notes, just not necessarily in the right order." There you go. That's my best attempt. Failed miserably. Go and watch that video. It's worth it. Yes, all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. I think that's a helpful analogy when it comes to considering how schemas can help, because it's taking all of the right answers and is putting them in the right sequence. It's creating this framework or web or matrix of understanding. And this is the graphic organizer that I use with my GCSE pupils whenever I'm explaining just that. So how do we get from higher fertility rates to lower rates over time? Well, the first thing that kickstarts it all is an increase in economic development within a country. It becomes wealthier. As a consequence of that, the government can invest in medical care, sanitation, nutrition. It can roll out vaccination programs that can help defeat childhood illnesses. The sanitation, particularly for the informal settlements in some of the towns and the cities in the developing world that don't have sanitation. One of the biggest killers and disease causes there is that people are living in their own filth. And if you can introduce proper sanitation, it's going to improve the situation. Nutrition and diet is helping to make us more resilient towards diseases. And as you get these things happening, you're getting this brilliant news across the world. The infant mortality rate is falling. There are fewer and fewer people. Or fewer and fewer children who are dying. And that is brilliant, brilliant news. As a result of that, now the phrasing of this always seems a little bit cold and calculating, but if you live in a society where there is no social care system in place, you're reliant on your informal networks like your friends and your family to look after you if you're ill and in old age, and therefore there's this need for large families. But if fewer children are dying, there's less need for a large family. Then the second thing that increased economic development can do means the government can invest in education for women. Now, the interesting thing with that is that it has this synergistic effect across a range of things. This is always fun to try and get some of the GCSE boys to try and make that connection without coming out with a sexist statement. They do struggle a little bit, to be honest with you. But the way that you could phrase this, so in traditional societies, in societies where gender roles are more typically assigned, it is more normal that the role of the woman would be as the caregiver and the family. It's more typical that the role of the woman will be to look after the children and the family. And therefore, if you educate women on things like the importance of immunisation, that brings up immunisation rates and sanitation, nutrition, etc. But it also leads down here to an increase in use of contraception. Simply we can say the consequences of pregnancy for women are slightly greater than they are for men. And as a result of that, then, there is the ability to control the family size. There may previously have been less need for large families, but now you have this situation where you can actually control family size. Furthermore, women being educated allows them to follow their careers. Women getting access to education not just in primary school but secondary and indeed into tertiary level. Women, in other words, getting exactly the same rights and access to education as men would. And as the society progresses there and women follow the careers, very often there's a desire for smaller families. Maybe women are getting married later and they've less time in the biological clock, and there's less of a desire for larger families. So you see there that synergistic effect of educating women. It is one of the most significant aspects of social development in a country that can bring fertility rates down. One final thing, as a country gets richer, you get more and more desire for material things, and there's less of a desire for large families. An interesting counterpoint to that, as I record this, there's been another change to the Chinese one-child family policy, which was softened about 3 years ago or so, and they've now softened it again, allowing families of up to 3. But what is happening in China is that there's been such a change in the culture in the years that the policy was in place that actual fact people are not wanting to have as many children. They'd rather have fewer children and the more affluent middle class lifestyle to which they have become accustomed. And also we can use this not only to look at how a change occurs over time in one country or region, but also the changes across space or area across the world today. And I'll show you that in a map in a moment. But what this does as a schema is takes all of the right notes and puts them in all the right order. It creates a structure and connections, and because I've represented it visually like this, it also supports the students as they are developing this schema. That schema that they're developing initially is shaky. It needs support, it needs consolidation. But when they get it, when they get all the right notes in the right order, this is the kind of thing that they can do. So they can take that schema understanding and apply it to a complex set of resources like this. This is a time-enabled world map. If I take this back to around about 1800, you'll see here that the fertility rates across the world were largely the same. There's a little bit of variation in Europe compared to other places, but largely the same. Now, as I scroll across here over time, watch what happens to Europe first of all. You're seeing the fertility rates coming down in Europe initially, and some of the other continents as well. If we come all the way up here to 1960s, say for example, and we can pause here and then start to really reflect and bring our knowledge in from that knowledge schema to help us to explain what's happening here. And we can see the spatial variation. We can see that Europe and North America and Australia are definitely having lower fertility rates than the three continents of the developing world, but Africa in particular has stubbornly high fertility rates. And if we move through this, we can see even into the 1990s, Africa is remaining high. But then we start to see this pattern emerging here. North Africa and South Africa are starting to be the same as South America. We bring this right up to date, and we can see the progression that Europe and South America and Asia, similar in many degrees. Africa has made big progress, but there's still this bit in the middle, sub-Saharan Africa, where the fertility rates are lower than they were, but they're still higher than everywhere else. And the model then allows my students to come in and take that, all those disconnected elements of the explanation, and apply it in a structured and organized way because they have got the schema developed. So that brings us to an important point that I think is worth being aware of then. If you have this schema well developed, you think differently to somebody who doesn't. Somebody who has all the right notes but in the wrong order can't make the similar kind of connections and apply their knowledge in the same way. In other words, it's the difference between how a novice will approach thinking about something and an expert. The difference is the development of the schema and the connections between those elements that allow you better to apply it. So that's a little bit of a reminder of schema theory and an example of how it works. It is very important, I think, for us to be thinking along these ways to help our students to learn. But here's the point. This schema building process can go wrong in multiple ways. This dotted line represents a sketchy development of the schema. Sometimes it goes wrong because of things that we don't quite anticipate in our planning. Sometimes it goes wrong despite the best planning. And if it goes wrong, because it's important to help us to learn, if the schema doesn't quite work, it can have some significant impacts. How can it go wrong? How does the schema process or schema building process go wrong? Well, I got the staff to consider and to think about different ways in which this could go wrong here. And I'll just give you a little bit of an illustration of some of the things here. The explanation by the teacher. Right, well, it could well be that I don't think about the prior knowledge sufficiently, and the pupils make a connection across to a different point of prior knowledge. It could well be that there are certain threshold concepts that block understanding and I don't explain them, and then that block understanding because I don't explain them rather than unlocking them. So let me give you an example of that from the first training session. I had a teacher come up to me afterwards and we talked about schema building to say, could you help me to understand that a little bit more? And I explained it using the example actually of the fertility levels that I've just shown you. And they said, right, so that's what a schema is. They said, I heard scheme, thought in educational circles, what's a scheme? It's a scheme of work. And they had gone off in a completely different direction. Now, I suppose in a sense I could have tried to anticipate that in my planning. And if I had, I could have headed that off. But the reality is, in a room full of students, no matter how much you try to anticipate the ways in which misinterpretation could occur, no matter how well you do that, I think it's probably best to assume that still some people will go off in their own direction. I think it's safe to assume that. It's useful to assume that because it means you're looking for it. Secondly, down here is the attention paid by the pupil. Now, that may well be just the fact that they aren't paying attention, they aren't listening. But even if they are paying attention to what you're saying, it still can go wrong. Here's another example. I was talking to my headmaster after the first training session, just debriefing on how it had gone. And he started to talk to me about a particular example. He started to talk about this fellow called Harold Abrams. Now, in that moment, I didn't immediately recognise the name. I kind of vaguely recognised the name. But here's the connection I made. Harold Abrams. Now, the chairman of Lurgan College Board of Governors is Stanley Abrams. I wonder, is Harold Abrams some relation of him? Now, because this was a one-on-one conversation, and I probably did this whenever I was trying to make that connection, my headmaster was able to stop and go, "Jared Safar." Of course, the right connection was made. But in a class of 28 pupils, something like that, you may not be able to spot all those subtle cues. And yet people might be making them. Now, the attention being paid by, but it's not that they're not listening. It's just that they've listened to something, they've heard what you've said, it doesn't immediately come to mind, and they're off trying to make the connection. Now, they might make the right connection, but they're not really paying attention to you in the moment. Or they might make the wrong connection and start misunderstandings and misapprehensions coming through. It also might go wrong in the quality of the existing schema. It might be a bunch of the right notes, but the order might be all over the place. How well the schema is interconnected and how easily and readily you can recall it. Very, very important. The better connected, the more easily recallable it is, the easier it is to assimilate that new information in. And then the process of schema integration between the teacher and pupil. Loads we could say about that, but it's that process where you're trying then to help the students to support them as they are integrating that in. And that process can be difficult. It can be one where they don't make the connections immediately. You need to support them and you need to help them with all of that. Now, all of that to say that no matter how well we design our explanations, and we need to design them well, the process of schema building can still go wrong, and it's useful for us to assume that it will go wrong so that we can intercept that and find out where we need to intervene. Rosenstein says this: we cannot simply repeat what we hear word for word. Rather, we connect our understanding of the new information to our existing schema and we construct a mental summary. This is the gist of what we've heard. However, when left on their own, many students make errors in the process of constructing this mental summary. These constructions, he says, are not really errors as such. They're attempts by students to be logical in an area where their background knowledge schema is weak. Which brings us to the teacher-pupil learning dialogue. Effective instruction is a crucial part of that. We need to deliver the message as clearly and precisely as possible, identifying the correct prior knowledge to draw attention to the students to, identifying where the threshold concepts are that we can then explain so they unlock and don't block. But even where the instruction is effective, where the message is delivered, the message isn't always received for the reasons that we've outlined. Love this quotation from Tom Sherrington. He says this: class is essentially a room full of highly individual, easily distracted, schema-forming brains grouped in front of us. It's vital that we get as much feedback from our students as we can, and this is where then we enter into that dialogue process to try to diagnose where the mistakes have been made, where the misconceptions have developed, so that we can head those off before they become embedded. Here's just a simple illustration of what I think Tom's quote says, that different people looking at this see different colours. I see blue and gold. You might see white and black or something like that. Even when we're experiencing the same input into our minds, we don't always interpret them in the same way. And there's this loss of fidelity. Back to the old cassette tapes. Every time you record them, the quality gets lost ever so slightly. This isn't like copying a digital file where the fidelity is kept. We can, as we explain things to others, as they begin to pick them up, they will reconstruct the gist of it, the mental summary, and you can have that loss of fidelity. So that brings us to this feedback loop. We need to engage in this process of feedback in order to find out where the mistakes are being made, where the misconceptions are developing, so we can head them off quickly. So this is feedback from the pupils to the teacher, and then feedback from the teacher to the pupils of this ongoing process in the moment. In fact, I'm going to offer this analogy. I think this is a useful analogy for us to bear in mind when it comes to this, and it's a dashboard. Now, what does a dashboard tell us? The dashboard gives immediate feedback across a whole range of different information about what's happening in the car. It's wide-ranging and it is presented in a timely manner. So imagine if we could have a feedback dashboard for the schema construction of our class. Imagine they're standing in front of you and you could see literally something like this coming up. Wide-ranging information amongst all the pupils presented in the moment so that you know how and when to respond. Is such a thing even possible? Yes. Yes, it is. But how do we find out what they know? Well, of course, that brings us then into the whole area of questioning. Teaching is not lecturing. We will interact and dialogue with our pupils. And part of the main reason why we want to ask questions is to diagnose the extent to which they're picking things up. Very often, however, when we do that, it's done as a process of sampling. I want you to think for a moment of your classes. Are there pupils that you tend to ask questions of more? Are there pupils that you tend not to ask questions of? Now, there might be good reasons why you'll not want to draw attention to people in the class, of course. But think about that. And think about your reasons why you'll choose some or others. Have you ever been in a situation where you've asked a difficult question, you've gone around a couple of people and you've got awful answers, and you just think, I desperately needed the right answer, and you just go to your safe pair of hands? Right, I know this pupil in the class is always going to get it right. They're sitting there thinking, I've got the right answer. Let's just cut to the chase and ask them. John, what do you think? Spot on. That's perfect. Whew. We've got the right answer. The class knows it. We can move on. But how broad is your sample? How much have you actually found out about what the pupils know in doing that? If you're standing in front of a class like this, what is the impression you'll have? What are you discerning about this class? It's the usual scenario, says this quotation, repeated in classrooms everywhere. A teacher asks the questions, a few hands shoot up, always the same hands. The hands that aren't raised instead prop up drooping heads or twiddle pens. Now, those who raise their hands listen in class, they engage with the topic and so achieve more highly. The others often let their attention drift. Message delivered, but is the message received? Let's see what this quotation by Rosenshine says. Effective teachers also stop to check for understanding. They check for understanding by, and he's given a couple of methods here. We're going to be taking a look at a whole bunch of those methods in our October training session. But it's the purpose of those methods that I want to really focus on in here. This checking has two purposes. Answering the questions might cause the students to elaborate on the material they've learned and to augment connections to other learning. Remember, we pick up the gist of what somebody has said, not word for word, and we need the chance to put that into words. If you ever ask a question to a pupil and they struggle to answer it and they go, I understand the answer, but I can't find the words. That's what's going on there. They've got the gist of it, but they need practice at putting it into their own words. Questioning can help with that. It also alerts the teacher whenever parts of the material need to be retaught. It's that diagnostic element. So let's think just of one method. As I say, most of the methods we'll look at will be in the training session in October, but let's look at one method here. How good is this as a diagnostic question? Now, I imagine that this is a question that most of us have asked many times in class, or a form of it. Have you all understood? That makes sense? Everybody happy? You all with me? All okay? Any questions? All good? Those kinds of things tend to be asked a lot. What do you learn about your class? What do you diagnose about your class if you ask a question in that form? Not very much, really. But how could we reframe this kind of question? Because we need to ask this kind of question. How do we reframe it to make it more effective? This is from Tom Sherrington. I love this. Not, have you all understood? What have you understood? Again, you can rephrase it. It doesn't need to be that sentence all the time, but okay, you've just explained something. Right, John, can you summarize for me a little bit here of what we've just said? Oh, that's great. That's great. Right. Sophie, can you pick up on that? Is there anything that you would disagree with in terms of what John has said, or anything you'd like to add? Yeah, great. Super. Very interesting. Right, Jessica, what about you? Which of those two answers do you think is a better answer, and why? And what you're able to do then is to bounce that around the class a little bit more, getting them to think, getting them to articulate, but as you listen, you're then able to diagnose. You're able to discern how well they've picked these things up. Okay, let's summarize together where we've been on this journey so far. We make sense of new knowledge by integrating it into our knowledge schemas. That's how meaning is made. Those schemas are structured, well-connected bodies of knowledge. All the right notes in all the right order. But this sense-making is affected significantly by our prior knowledge. It can be positively affected if we make the right connections, or negatively affected whenever I went off on the wrong Abraham, whenever my headmaster was talking to me. There's a case in point of work and go wrong. Schema building can be unlocked or blocked by threshold concepts. Salt of metal. If you don't know what that is, you're going to struggle to go further. Therefore, the role of diagnostic questioning is to help us as teachers to discern how effective the schema building process is being, present tense, for each pupil. How wide is your sample in our class? If we do that well, we spot misconception as it arises. We can clarify, we can re-explain, we can give other ways to allow the pupils to make sense and meaning. And if we don't, we might end up in a situation where pupils are left behind. Whenever I was in primary school, I think maybe around about P5, I vividly remember the work that you had to do whenever we had finished doing the official work. The teacher rewarded us for working well by giving us more work, Anyway, there was this little pack of laminated A5 coloured sheets with maths problems on them. And I remember any time I had to go up and get those, and the teacher wouldn't be looking, so you're supposed to pick them at random, but I was able to select the one carefully. Because there was a phrase that I was always wanting to avoid in those, because I knew if I brought that little card back to my desk, I'd be stuck. Now, the problem was, this was a phrase that the teacher I knew had taught us. It hadn't really made sense to me, and I was too embarrassed to admit. So I tried to hide it. The phrase, find the difference between. Now, if somebody had said to me, Alistair, that just means take away. Oh, all right, really? Fair enough. Of course I would have been able to do it, but I didn't know what that phrase meant. The teacher never knew. It's not really her fault, because I worked pretty hard to hide it from her. But there's an example of how that misconception or that flawed schema building on my part stopped me from making progress, and the importance for us as teachers to be able to diagnose and to discern. So there we have the feedback loop, the message delivered. Yes, we need to be as clear as possible. We need to anticipate what the prior knowledge is, the threshold concepts, and the possible misconceptions. We need to try and anticipate that as much as we can. But even if we do, the schema building process will go wrong somewhere for someone. And that's why the message delivered is only part of it. The message received is the other part of it. That's why we need this dialogue, this feedback loop. Now, understanding why, understanding the intent provides us the foundation for what we're going to be doing next as we move forward. What I did with the training after that was I divided the staff into groups of 3, and I had combined together scientists and teachers of humanities purposely, and I'd asked them to pick something from their A level that they taught that wouldn't be everyday long knowledge, and I asked them then to come up with a visual representation, graphic organizer of the schema, to identify the prior knowledge, to identify the threshold concepts, and then they had to teach it to the other 2 in the group. Now, what I was hoping in this is that they would be teaching it to people that were, to all intents and purposes, novices. At least in this area. They wouldn't have their own well-developed schema to make connections where you didn't make them explicit. And I also asked the teachers that were listening not to ask any questions if they didn't understand, act like a typical class and just not ask those questions. It therefore was the role of the teacher that was explaining to ask the diagnostic questions to see how well people were picking it up. Now, we did this socially distanced, obviously, because of COVID. I wish that I'd been able to go around and listen in. I've heard some very positive feedback from staff of the experience that they had with that. And the ability that they then had to almost to discover what it's like to be sitting in as a novice without those connections. And you need to have these well spelled out to you. So that was the session. We took quite a bit of time doing that and getting some feedback. What's coming next is a whole bunch of methods. Now, I am shamelessly borrowing from the work by Tom Sherrington and Oliver Caviglioli in their excellent walkthroughs book. I've tweaked some of these a little bit, but these are some of the methods that we're going to be exploring. If our purpose and our goal is to diagnose where the schema building has gone wrong, what are the methods that we can use to do that? Our training is coming up in early October, but that just gives you a little bit of a sneak peek. And that is the next stage in our training of how we can use questions in the classroom to aid pupil schema building.